even to the children of Israel. So the death of Moses marks the end of a generation. Well, we'll just read this in Numbers 14. Numbers 14, we have verse 26. And the Lord spake unto Moses and unto Aaron, saying, How long shall I bear with this evil congregation which murmur against me? I have heard the murmurings of the children of Israel, which they murmur against me. Say unto them, As truly as I live, saith the Lord, as ye have spoken in mine ears, so I will do to you. Your carcasses shall fall in the wilderness, and all that were numbered of you, according to the whole number, from 20 years old and upward, which have murmured against me, doubtless ye shall not come into the land concerning which I swear to make you dwell therein, save Caleb the son of Jephthah and Joshua the son of Nun. So if you remember, the children of Israel, whenever Moses, God had told Moses to send in 12 spies, one from each tribe of Israel, into the land that they had been promised, go in and spy it out and bring the report back to us. And 12 of them went in, and when they came back out, 10 of them said, Oh my, it's a land of giants, and that we were like grasshoppers in their sight, and that we just can't do it. And Joshua and Caleb were saying, No, let's go right now. We can go in and we can take the land because the Lord gave it to us. So 10 of them were saying, didn't have any faith in what God had said that He could do. And so what happened was, in Numbers 14, the first part of the chapter, it says, And all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. And all the children of Israel murmured against Moses and against Aaron. And the whole congregation said unto them, Would God that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would God we had died in the wilderness? And wherefore hath the Lord brought us into this land to fall by the sword, that our wives and our children should be a prey? Were it not better for us to return into Egypt? And they said one to another, Let us make a captain, and let us return unto Egypt. So that was the reason why God pronounced them an evil congregation, and that whole generation from 20 years old and up, you're all going to die in the wilderness. So in Joshua, Moses had committed a sin, and he was told that he also couldn't see the land, because rather than speaking to the rock for water, he had smote it. And so because of that, he wasn't allowed to go in either. And so whenever all the congregation had died, then Moses was finally the last one to die. Moses, as the leader, was the last one to die. So that entire generation had been condemned. So now it was time that the people that were going to go into the land, whenever in Joshua 1:1 and 2 there, he says, Moses is dead, now therefore arise and go over this Jordan, all this people. So this new generation, this generation of those that had been 19 years old and younger, whenever Israel committed this sin of unfaithfulness, this new generation was going in to take the land. The old generation had been cursed, and it was put away. So the cursed generation had been cut off, and a new generation was ready to enter into the land. Now, if you look in Matthew 3, where John the Baptist calls, well, we often look at Matthew 3 is what that says, where John the Baptist calls the leadership of Israel a generation of vipers. We always look at that and we always say he's talking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees there, and he's talking to the leadership. But if you look in Luke 3 verse 7, Then said he to the multitude that came forth to be baptized of him, O generation of vipers, who hath warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Bring forth therefore fruits worthy of repentance, and begin not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham to our father, for I say unto you that God is able of these stones to raise up children to Abraham. And if you compare that with the passage in Matthew 3 that we're always going to, about the only difference you see there is in Matthew 3:7, but when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees come to his baptism, and here in Luke 3 he says, then he said to the multitude that came forth to be baptized of him. So the big difference is in Matthew 3 he's talking to the leadership, and they're just coming to see his baptism. In Luke 3, he's talking to the multitudes that are coming to be baptized, and he says the same thing to them. So we can see from that whenever he's saying the same thing to both the leadership and the multitudes, we can see that this generation of Israelites had been condemned. The same way that the Israelites before whenever Moses died, that generation before that had been condemned. So they're condemned to the same as the generation in the wilderness, and now a new generation, whenever he says God is able of these stones to raise up children to Abraham, he's talking about these stones are going to be raised up, and we're going to get to the stones later on. But right now we can see that Joshua begins with the final judgment on the faithless generation and a new generation preparing to go into the land. The gospel accounts begin with judgment pronounced on the evil generation and the calling out of a new generation. So in both cases we have the pronouncement of the old generation is cursed, and we're going to call out a new generation. And this becomes the main theme of Jesus' ministry. We read in Matthew 23, verse 34, wherefore, behold, I send unto you prophets and wise men and scribes, and some of them ye shall kill and crucify, and some of them ye shall scourge in your synagogues and persecute them from city to city, that upon you may come all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias the son of Barachias, whom he slew between the temple and the altar. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon this generation. So we can see the entire generation had been cursed the same way it had been cursed in the wilderness. And this continues even in the book of Acts. Whenever Peter's talking, he says in Acts 2:40, and with many other words did he testify and exhort, saying, save yourselves from this untoward generation. So those Israelites who were faithful now had to save themselves from this untoward generation, and that was part of the water baptism. Was they weren't saving their souls in that water baptism, but they were saving themselves from the untoward generation and from the cursed generation. So then next in Joshua we have the story of the two spies that are sent out to search the land. So in Joshua 2 verse 1, and Joshua the son of Nun sent out of Shittim 2 men to spy secretly, saying, go view the land, even Jericho. And they went and came into a harlot's house named Rahab, and lodged there. And it was told the king of Jericho, saying, behold, there came men in hither to the night of the children of Israel to search out the country. And the king of Jericho sent unto Rahab, saying, bring forth the men that are come to thee, which are entered into thy house, for they be come to search out the country. And the woman took the 2 men and hid them, and said thus, there came men unto me, but I wist not whence they were. And it came to pass about the time of the shutting of the gate, when it was dark, that the men went out. Whither the men went, I wot not. Pursue after them quickly, for ye shall surely overtake them. So we know about the story of Rahab, and we won't read the whole passage, but the king comes to her and says this, and she says, they already left. And so she takes them, and she lives on the wall, and she takes them up to the roof of the wall, and she hides them in bundles of flax, and she hides them there. And then at night, then she lets them down by a cord, and she gets the promise out of them that whenever you come to destroy us, save me and my house. And they tell her, anybody that's in your room with you, they'll be saved. Everybody else is condemned. So we see that the king of Jericho is looking for righteous men from Israel to kill them, but they are hidden by Rahab. Now in Matthew 2, verse 7, then Herod, when he had privily called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. And they sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search diligently for the young child, and when you have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also. So here in the beginning of the Gospels, we have another king, and he finds out about this child, and he tells the wise men, you go to Bethlehem, and when you find them, you come back and you tell me where they are, because I want to go worship them. Well, of course, he didn't want to go worship them. He wanted to go kill them. So then the wise men, God tells them in a dream that, you don't go back to Herod, don't tell him where they are. And so the wise men, they left another way. Then in Matthew 2, verse 13, and when they were departed, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise and take the young child and his mother, and flee into Egypt, and be thou there until I bring thee word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night, and departed into Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken of the Lord by the prophet, saying, Out of Egypt I have called my son. Now obviously this is a fulfillment of a prophecy, but also just the same way the two righteous men were hid by Rahab, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus are now going to be hid in Egypt. And if we look at a few verses in the Old Testament, we can see that another name for Egypt is actually Rahab. And we see in Isaiah 51, verse 9, Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of God, awake as in the ancient days, in the generation of old. Art thou not that cut Rahab and wounded the dragon? Art thou not it which hath dried the sea, the waters of the great deep, that hath made the depths of the sea a way for the ransom to pass over? When God dried up that sea and let the ransom pass over, they were escaping. And it says here that hath cut Rahab. So they were escaping from Egypt. So Rahab is another word, another name that God uses for Egypt. We see again in Psalms 89, verse 9. Thou rulest the raging of the sea, when the waves thereof arise, thou stillest them. Thou hast broken Rahab in pieces as one that is slain. Thou hast scattered thine enemies with thy strong arm. Now when you compare that back to Exodus 15, verse 4, Pharaoh's chariots and his host hath he cast into the sea. His chosen captains also are drowned in the Red Sea. The depths have covered them. They sank into the bottom of a stone. Thy right hand, O Lord, has become glorious. Thy right hand, O Lord, hath dashed in pieces the enemy. So when he's talking about the raging of the sea, and then he stilled the waves thereof, and then thou hast broken Rahab in pieces, and then down here in Exodus he says, Thy right hand, O Lord, hath dashed in pieces thine enemy. The enemy was Egypt, and they were dashed in pieces. So again, Rahab is another title for Egypt. And we see this also in Psalms 87:4, and we're not going to go there, but so we can see that you have the king of Jericho searching out these righteous men to kill them, and they are hidden by Rahab, and then they're rescued by Rahab. Now in Jesus' time, you have a wicked King Herod, and he's seeking after the newborn King of Israel, Jesus, to destroy him, and they are hidden in Rahab, in Egypt. So they go down to Egypt the same way Rahab hid the spies. Now Joseph and Jesus and Mary are hidden in Egypt or in Rahab. So now we'll get to the part I started about. I think that the next thing that happens in Joshua is the crossing of the Jordan River. And to my mind, I think that it is definitely a baptism. It's never called a baptism in Scripture, but if you compare it to what happened whenever they crossed the Red Sea, I think you can see pretty plainly that it's almost a mirror image of what happened there. So if in 1 Corinthians 10:2 it says Israel was baptized unto Moses. And so in Joshua 3:7 it says, and the Lord said unto Joshua, this day will I begin to magnify thee in the sight of all Israel, that they know that as I was with Moses, so I will be with thee. And then on the day that they crossed the river Jordan, God again says to Joshua, God again says, on that day the Lord magnified Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they feared Moses all the days of his life. So there you have baptized unto Moses. Here God has exalted Joshua the same way he exalted Moses. And then back in 1 Corinthians 2, whenever it's talking about the baptism of Israel and the cloud and the sea, in the first part it says they were baptized in the cloud. Now, at that time they didn't have the Ark of the Covenant with them. But now they have the Ark of the Covenant with them. And in Joshua 3 verse 10, and Joshua says, hereby ye shall know that the living God is among you. Now, before they knew the living God was among them because they had that cloud, which the cloud went behind them, and here comes Egypt after them. The cloud went behind them, and Egypt couldn't see them. So the cloud was hiding them, and they knew God was with them because that was a supernatural thing that was happening. So, hereby ye shall know that the living God is among you, and he will without fail drive out from you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. Behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth passeth over before you into Jordan. So here, before you have the cloud, now you have the ark. The cloud was a witness that God was with them. The ark is a witness that God is with them. And so they were baptized in the cloud and in the sea. And if you look in Exodus 4:22, it says, and the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea upon the dry ground. In Joshua 3:17, whenever they are crossing over the river Jordan, all the Israelites passed over on dry ground until all the people were passed clean over Jordan. So, again, you can see the similarities of what's going on here. And then in 1 Corinthians 10 verse 3 it says, and all did eat the same spiritual meat, and did drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. So Christ was present with them whenever they were baptized unto Moses, and they drank out of that spiritual rock. Christ was with them. Then we see in Joshua 5, right after they get across the Jordan River, and the waters go back to the way they were. And it came to pass in verse 13, and it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho, that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him and said unto him, art thou for us or for our adversaries? And he said, nay, but as captain of the host of the Lord I am now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and did worship, and said unto him, what saith my Lord unto his servant? And the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, loose thy shoe from off thy foot, for the place wherein thou standest is holy. And Joshua did so. Now do you remember another time whenever that that same phrase, loose thy shoe from off thy foot, for the place where thou standest is holy. Do you remember another time that happened? The burning bush with Moses. And that was Christ in the burning bush. That was Christ that was with them, that followed them. And now here you have Christ, the visual personification of God on earth, appearing to Joshua, and he has his sword drawn. So he's ready to go and fight the battles for the Israelites. So just as the rock was Christ with Israel, now Christ is there to fight Israel's battles. So the way I look at it is Tracy, whenever he went over the baptism of Moses, the baptism unto Moses in the sea, what he said, and I completely agree with him, was that baptism identified them as a nation and as a separate people unto God. So that was their identification. Now to me, whenever they crossed the Jordan River, and that old generation is gone now, and the new generation is crossing, and you have basically the same thing happening, and they're baptized unto Joshua the same way they were baptized unto Moses, but now rather than being identified as a nation and a set-apart people, they've already had that identification. Now they're going to be identified with the land, and that land is going to be part of who they are. And you see that all throughout the Old Testament. It's all about the land, the land, the land, the land. So in Joshua 1:11, pass through the host and command the people, saying, prepare you victuals, for within 3 days ye shall pass over this Jordan to go in and possess the land which the Lord your God giveth you to possess it. So, to my mind, they are being identified with that land that they're going in to possess, and they're being baptized unto Joshua, who is now the leader, the same type of leader, magnified in the same way as Moses, and they're going in to take that land. So now, and this is interesting, when they passed through the Jordan River, one man out of each tribe picked up a large river stone, and they carried it to a place where they camped. And there Joshua set up a memorial. And Joshua 4, verse 20, we read about that. And those 12 stones which they took out of Jordan did Joshua pitch in Gilgal. And he spake unto the children of Israel, saying, when your children shall ask their fathers in time to come, saying, what mean those stones? Then ye shall let your children know, saying, Israel came over this Jordan on dry land, for the Lord your God dried up the waters of Jordan before you until you passed over, as the Lord your God did in the Red Sea. And there again you have that comparison. This is the same thing that happened at the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we were gone over, that all the people of the earth might know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that ye might fear the Lord your God forever. But now Joshua himself, by himself, it's not the 12 men, one out of each tribe, that carries a stone on his back to where they encamp. Joshua does something by himself that's kind of curious. In Joshua 4:9, and Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests which bear the ark of the covenant stood, and they are there until this day. And that's the only verse you have about that. God doesn't say, hey Joshua, take some stones out and put it in the middle of the river there while the priests are still standing there. Joshua just goes, he collects 12 stones. They took 12 stones from the river to set up as a memorial. Now Joshua takes 12 stones from the land into the middle of the river and sets them up in the middle of the river. And that's all we hear about that. So keep those stones in your mind for a little bit, and we're going to talk about them in a little bit. But that's kind of important. And the last point to make is where they crossed the river, and in your first map. We'll look at that here in a second. Joshua 3:16, that the waters which came down from above stood up and rose upon a heap very far from the city Adam, that is beside Zaratan, and those people came down toward the sea of the plain, even the salt. And I don't know what. Let's try this again. The waters which came down from above and stood and rose upon an heap very far from the city Adam, that is beside Zaratan, and those that came down toward the sea of the plain, even the salt sea, failed, were cut off, and the people passed over right against Jericho. So if you look on your first map here, and you look down here, this is the Salt Sea, this big body of water here. Now if you follow the Jordan River upstream on the left or on the eastern side, it didn't print out very well, but the first city you have that is right on the Jordan River, it's right where that tributary comes in, is called Adam. And it said that the waters were cut off far above Adam. So even further upstream is where the waters were cut off. So now you see all these other little tributaries coming in to the Jordan. It also says that it says that the waters which came down from above stood on a heap, and those that came down toward the sea of the plain, even the Salt Sea. So not only the River Jordan, but all these little tributaries that would have come into Jordan, they all stand up on a heap also. Now the city of Adam, now down here if you look, it didn't print out very well, but on the right hand side of the west side, if you go straight up from the Salt Sea, the first city you see there is Jericho. And he says they passed over right against Jericho. So straight to the east is where they passed. And from that point up to the city Adam is 15 or 16 miles. And the water stood up on a heap even further up. So all that entire region, the waters were all dried up and the waters were standing on a heap. And that's how the kings, all these kings that got together then to fight against them, it would have been pretty obvious what's going on. Something really supernatural is going on. But they passed directly east of Jericho. So now on this map, you don't see it very well. It has Gilgal kind of like northeast of Jericho, and that's just a guess. Nobody has any idea exactly where Gilgal is. If I were guessing, I would say it would be due east of Jericho, because they crossed right against Jericho. They were heading for Jericho, and then they camped in Gilgal. They made that the name, and they camped there. So it was right in that area there, between Jericho and the river, that they would have set up those stones as a memorial. So now, so we have that baptism unto Joshua, and now whenever we get to the accounts of John the Baptist's baptism, we find something kind of strange. In John 1:28, these things were done in Bethabara beyond Jordan, where John was baptizing. So whenever it says beyond Jordan, you're always looking from Jerusalem. So when you look at from Jerusalem, which is southwest of where Jericho is, on down here, it's in big letters, you should probably be able to see it, but X5 is where it is. But you're always looking for so John was baptizing beyond Jordan. So he was baptizing on the other side of the Jordan River. He wasn't baptizing on the same side of the Jordan River where Jerusalem was. He was baptizing on the other side of that river. And also where he was baptizing, it says in Bethabara. Now all the new Bibles will tell you that that's not right, that that's Bethany. That should say Bethany there. And there is no Bethany that anybody knows of that was ever there. But even some of the King James Bibles, like if you have a Schofield Reference Bible, he has a little note there at Bethabara. You go over and you look at the note, and it says Bethany. So everybody thinks that the King James Bible is wrong, and Bethabara is wrong, and it should say Bethany. And it wasn't the Bethany that's over close to Jerusalem, but it was another Bethany, and that's what everybody believes. And I found this little tidbit on the internet about that. This all happened at Bethany on the other side of the Jordan. Oh, okay. There's some discrepancy about the mention of Bethany in John 1:28, which states, "This all happened at Bethany on the other side of Jordan where John was baptizing." The fact that Bethany was on the other side of the Jordan tells us it is not the same place as the town which Lazarus lived. If you read the King James Version of the Bible instead, the issue is almost cleared up by the use of the word Bethabara in place of Bethany. Unfortunately, as the King James Version is the only version to make this distinction, it is not 100% reliable. Well, it is 100% reliable, and it's a very important distinction, because Bethabara, if you look up in the dictionary of names of Bible names, what Bethabara means, it means house of passage or ferry house. Now, if you look at Strong's Concordance notes, you have it says Bethabara. It's of Hebrew origin, and then it gives you the two words that make up the word Bethabara. So the first part is Beth, or Beth, what we call Beth, and that just means a house in the greatest variation of applications, especially family. So you see a city named Bethel. That means this is the house of God. This is where God dwells. If you see a place named Beth Baal, which there was one, that's where Baal dwells. That's his dwelling place. It's where the families gather, and that's the house. The second part, the Abara part, comes from this word, and it means a crossing place on a ferry or plane. So what you basically have is a literal translation would be crossing place of a house or family. So where John the Baptist is baptizing at Bethabara, he's baptizing at the exact same spot where the children of Israel crossed the Jordan River. He's right there where they were. And usually, if you look on the map that has this place on the map, it usually has the place right. It just has it called Bethany rather than Bethabara. But he's literally due east of where the old Jericho was. So now we've seen that when John's baptizing, Tracy, when he went through that, he says that they're being baptized. That baptism unto John is identifying them as as part of the little flock, as part of God's called out group, and that's what John's ministry was. So we can see that when John was baptizing, that entire generation had been condemned. They were a generation of vipers, and all the sins from every generation had been put on this generation. So now what John's doing, he's identifying that new generation. If we have, let me see. If we have time, yeah, I think we have time here. If you just go to Psalms 22, if you go to Psalms 22, in the Old Testament, there's several references, and Psalms 22 and Psalms 24 are good ones, to a new generation that's going to arise. And in Psalms 22 and verse 30, he's talking about, this is, well, if you look at verse 28, for the kingdom is the Lord's and he is the governor among nations. So he's talking about the kingdom. In the first part of Psalms 22, he's talking about the crucifixion. In the second part, he's talking about the kingdom. And then you get to verse 30, a seed shall serve him, it shall be accounted to the Lord for a generation. So you have that seed that is accounted as a generation. Now in 24, Psalms 24 and verse 6. This is the generation of them that seek him, that seek thy face, O Jacob, Selah. So the generation that seeks the Lord's face, they're accounted as a new generation. So the cursed generation, they're being separated out by the baptism of John as a new generation. So the same way all the old generation died off on the other side of the Jordan, now a new generation is coming, being baptized in the Jordan, and interestingly, they have to go back to the place where Israel started on the other side of Jordan to get baptized. They have to wade through the river, go over and get baptized, and then wade back through again. So they are literally crossing the Jordan again, the same way that Israel crossed the Jordan back in Joshua, only now they're doing it through the water. Joshua did it on dry ground. So in the same way a new generation had been baptized unto Joshua in the Jordan River and been identified with the land, a new generation was being baptized into the kingdom to be identified with the king. They were literally recrossing the Jordan River at this point. So they were being baptized, they were being identified with the kingdom and with the king. And of course we know the king was Jesus. And do you know what? Jesus is the Greek word for what name? Do you know? Joshua. Joshua is the Hebrew name for Jesus. If you look up Jesus in the Dictionary of Proper Names, and you look up Joshua in the Dictionary of Proper Names, definition is exactly the same. It's the same word, only Jesus is Greek, Joshua is Hebrew. So, now where are we here? Okay, now, back to the stones. The stones that Joshua himself took from the land and took into the middle of the Jordan River. Now, whenever John the Baptist sees the multitudes coming to him for baptism, he says, bring forth therefore fruits worthy of repentance, and begin not to say within yourselves, we have Abraham to our father, for I say unto you that God is able of these stones to raise up children unto Abraham. Now he's baptizing in the river, the same place where they crossed the river, the same place where Joshua took those stones and set them up in the middle of the river. So what stones do you think he's talking about? He's not just talking about these pebbles on the beach. There's 12 specific stones in the middle of that river that he's talking about and he's referencing, and it's a metaphorical thing, as we're going to see, but he's saying these stones, God's able to raise them up, and those stones are the stones that Joshua had placed in the middle of the river. When Christ was baptized by John, he was identified as the high priest and the rock that could take those 12 stones and bring about the promised kingdom. Let's go to Daniel 2. Daniel 2. And we talk all about all of them going the wrong way. Daniel is the last of the major prophets. And Daniel 2. See, this is what happens when I decide to shortcut this stuff. Daniel 2, verse 44. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. For as much as thou sawest that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and it brake in pieces the iron, the brass, the clay, the silver, the gold, the great God hath made known to the king what shall come to pass thereof, and the dream is certain, and the interpretation is sure thereof. So Jesus Christ is that chief cornerstone, and he is going to, of these stones, create a new generation, and he's the stone that's going to dash into pieces all of his enemies. The same way when Joshua went into the land and he cleaned up the land, he threw out all the Baal worship and all the Ashtaroth worship and everything. Whenever Jesus comes in his earthly ministry, he goes about the land, and every place he goes, he's casting out devils, he's casting out demons, and he's cleaning up that land. So he was the chief cornerstone to those that trusted in him, but he was a stone of offense to those who wouldn't believe. So that generation with the stony hearts, they were the ones that wouldn't believe. The ones that believed and came to John's baptism, and then later on to Peter's baptism, they were the ones that were going to be the good stones. Now, it's interesting that Jesus, as the chief cornerstone, when you're talking about stones, the first thing he says to the one that's going to be the chief of the 12 stones that he sets up, is the first thing he says in chapter 1, verse 41. This is talking about Andrew then. He first findeth his own brother Simon, and saith unto him, We have found the Messiah, which is being interpreted the Christ. And he brought him unto Jesus, and when Jesus beheld him, he said, Thou art Simon, the son of Jonah. Thou shalt be called Cephas, which is by interpretation a stone. So here we have the same way that Joshua set those stones up in the middle of the river. Jesus is now metaphorically taking those stones back out of the river, and he's setting up the system of governance for his kingdom. Peter was the lead apostle. It says the gospel of the uncircumcision was committed unto Peter. So Peter was the lead apostle, and the first thing that Jesus says to him is, You're Simon, the son of Jonah. From now on you're going to be called Cephas, which being interpreted is a stone. So Peter, who's called a stone, later writes to those who believed, but they had their program interrupted by the dispensation of grace. In 1 Peter 2:4, he says, To whom coming as unto a living stone, that's Jesus Christ, disallowed indeed of men, but chosen of God, and precious, ye also, as lively stones, are built up a spiritual house and holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. Wherefore it is also contained in the Scripture, Behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect, precious, and he that believeth on him shall not be confounded. So here we have in 1 Peter, he's calling all those believers lively stones or living stones. And so I think when John, whenever he says, think not to say within yourself, we have Abraham to our father, God is able to raise up of these stones children unto Abraham. I think he's metaphorically talking about the stones in the river, but literally I think he's talking about when the multitudes are coming to him. We see over and over again in the Old Testament, God talks about the stony hearts. And so here comes these people with the stony hearts to John's baptism, and he's going to take those with the stony hearts and raise up children to Abraham, because Paul says that not all children of Abraham are of Abraham, because not all Israel is Israel, because it's only those that believe. So those stones that he's raising up are those that believe, and Peter says that you are lively stones, you're living stones, you're the stones that Christ raised up as the chief cornerstone. So, and now there's a lot more that could be said about this, but the main thing about this is Christ was baptized in the very spot that Israel came out of the wilderness into the land to possess it. Joshua's generation was condemned, and he led a new generation into the promised land. Israel was condemned, and God, through John, then Christ, began building a new generation to inhabit that land, and that started out at the exact same spot, and it was on the other side of Jordan, so they again had to cross through Jordan to get rid of that old stink of the condemned generation. And Joshua's promise was the old covenant. Jesus' promise was the new covenant. And the Jordan River was the starting point for the establishment of the old covenant, and the exact same spot was the starting point for the establishment of the new covenant. So that's all I got. Is there any questions or comments? Yeah. Were you able to follow that? Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So 1 Peter 2:4-8, behold, I lay in Zion the chief cornerstone. Is that Christ?
Yeah, the chief cornerstone is Christ. Yeah.
Peter, Cephas, was a stone.
Right.
But a different stone than Christ.
Right. You know where he says to Peter, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I shall build my church, and the gates of hell should not." Well, that's kind of a play on words. Like the Catholic Church takes that rock that he's going to build his church on as being Peter. But that rock is Christ. Thou art Peter, and upon this rock, Jesus Christ, will I build. And then he's going to give the keys of the kingdom to Peter. Peter gets the keys to the kingdom, but he's not the rock that's built on. Peter is a little stone. You're a little stone, and you're going to build on the big stone, and here's the keys to the kingdom to do that. So yeah, Peter was a little stone, and Christ was the chief cornerstone.
But you can see why it's confusing.
Yeah.
Christ calls him the stone, but he is the stone.
Right. Yeah, Christ is the stone, the rock, and that's the same way in Paul says, no foundation can any man lay that has been laid, and that foundation is Christ. So Peter laid his foundation on Christ. Paul laid his foundation on Christ. They're building two different programs, but the foundation is the same. And that's the rock, and that is Christ. Is that it? Okay. Thank you.